In the quiet town of Cedarwood, the Johnson family was the epitome of the American dream. Tom Johnson, at 35 years old, had worked tirelessly to build his business from the ground up, becoming one of the town's most respected entrepreneurs. He was a man of discipline, a provider, and a devoted husband to Sarah, his wife of 7 years. The couple was often seen together at community events, their smiles wide and their hands intertwined, embodying what many in the town considered the perfect marriage. Sarah, 10 years younger than Tom, was the picture of elegance and grace. She had married young, choosing a life of stability and comfort over the adventures her peers sought. In Cedarwood, she was known not just as Tom's wife, but as a kind and charitable woman who volunteered at the local shelter and organized bake sales for the church. Her beauty was matched only by her reputation for being warm-hearted and welcoming, making her one of the town's most beloved figures. Together, Tom and Sarah seemed to have it all. A beautiful home on Maple Street, where the lawns were always manicured and the flower beds vibrant with seasonal blooms. Their life was a series of dinner parties, weekend getaways, and plans for the future that included starting a family. To their neighbors, the Johnsons were the model couple, successful, happy, and deeply in love. However, beneath the surface of this idyllic life, there were cracks that few could see. Tom's growing business demands meant long hours at the office, leaving Sarah alone for much of the time. While she outwardly maintained her cheerful demeanor, inside she struggled with feelings of loneliness and isolation. The vibrant social life they once enjoyed had dwindled as Tom's work consumed more of his time and energy, leaving Sarah to fend for herself in a house that felt increasingly empty. Enter James Johnson, Tom's father, a man who had always been a pillar of strength and wisdom in the Johnson family. At 55, James was still in his prime. Handsome, charismatic, and deeply respected in Cedarwood for his decades of community service. Widowed for several years, James had a close relationship with his son and daughter-in-law, often spending time at their home, offering advice and sharing stories from his past. To Sarah, James represented a connection to a world of warmth and affection that she found lacking in her marriage. What began as casual conversations over coffee soon turned into something more. James, ever attentive and kind, noticed a sadness in Sarah's eyes that others overlooked. He began to check on her more frequently, offering comfort and companionship. Their connection deepened with each passing day, crossing boundaries that neither had anticipated. A lingering touch here, a shared glance there. Soon, the line between familial affection and forbidden desire blurred beyond recognition. The affair started innocently enough, or so Sarah told herself. But the more time they spent together, the more the attraction grew. For James, the thrill of rekindling his youthful passions with a younger woman was intoxicating. For Sarah, James filled a void that had been growing in her marriage, a void of attention, affection, and understanding. As their relationship developed, they became increasingly secretive. Meetings were planned with precision, texts exchanged with the utmost caution. They rationalized their actions, convincing themselves that what they shared was special, different, and somehow justified by the circumstances. But with each stolen moment, they edged closer to a precipice that neither could see, where the illusion of a perfect family would come crashing down, leading to a chain of events that would forever alter their lives and those around them. As the relationship between Sarah and James deepened, the thrill of secrecy fueled their passion. What had started as innocent conversations in the kitchen while Tom was away slowly morphed into a series of stolen glances, accidental touches, and shared moments that hinted at something far more illicit. The line between familial love and forbidden desire blurred, as both Sarah and James began to explore emotions they never expected to find in each other. For Sarah, the affair was a lifeline. Her marriage to Tom, once filled with love and laughter, had become a routine. Tom's growing preoccupation with his business meant long hours away from home, leaving Sarah feeling increasingly isolated. Despite the luxuries of a comfortable life, she yearned for something more, someone who could see her, understand her, and make her feel desired again. James, with his charm and maturity, provided the attention she craved. His presence was a balm for her loneliness, and soon, what started as a friendship evolved into a dangerous and passionate affair. James, on the other hand, was captivated by Sarah's youthful beauty and vivacity. The years since his wife's passing had been lonely, and while he had found solace in his community work, there was a void in his life that no amount of volunteer hours could fill. Sarah's affection, her need for him, awakened desires that he had long suppressed. The thrill of the forbidden made each encounter with Sarah more intoxicating. He told himself that what they shared was special, that it was a connection born out of loneliness and unfulfilled desires, a connection that somehow made their actions justifiable. Their affair began in small, inconspicuous ways. A brush of the hand as they passed each other in the hallway, lingering eye contact during family dinners, and increasingly intimate conversations during the afternoons they spent alone. These moments were electrifying, charged with an energy neither had felt in years. The first time they kissed, it was as if the floodgates had opened. The kiss was hesitant at first, both aware of the gravity of what they were doing. But as the days went by, their physical relationship intensified. Meetings became more frequent and increasingly risky. Sarah and James developed a routine. Tom's business trips and late nights at the office provided the perfect cover for their secret encounters. They met at James's house, under the pretense of family visits, or in secluded areas around Cedarwood where they were unlikely to be seen. Each meeting was a delicate dance of desire and deceit, the thrill of potentially being caught only adding to the excitement. However, with the excitement came the inevitable weight of guilt. Sarah was torn between the love she once felt for Tom and the new, intense emotions she had for James. The more their affair progressed, the more complicated her feelings became. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the pull of her attraction to James was stronger than her conscience. Each day, she promised herself it would be the last, but every time she saw him, all her resolutions melted away. For James, the affair was equally conflicting. As a father, he felt the crushing guilt of betraying his own son. He knew that if Tom ever discovered the truth, it would destroy their relationship beyond repair. Yet, the allure of Sarah, the need to feel desired and alive again, kept him coming back for more. James began to compartmentalize his life, putting up walls to separate his affair with Sarah from his relationship with Tom. But these walls were fragile, built on a foundation of lies that were bound to collapse under the weight of their secrets. As the affair continued, the stakes grew higher. The guilt they both felt began to take a toll on their emotional states, but the fear of losing each other kept them entangled in their web of deceit. Neither Sarah nor James could foresee the disaster that was brewing on the horizon, a disaster that would soon shatter the illusion of control they believed they had over their lives and expose their secret in the most devastating way possible. As the months passed, Tom Johnson began to sense a shift in the atmosphere of his home. What once felt like a safe haven now seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension. Sarah, once vibrant and attentive, had become increasingly distant, her moods fluctuating between nervousness and detachment. Tom initially attributed her behavior to stress or perhaps dissatisfaction with his frequent absences due to work. However, a nagging feeling deep within him suggested there was more to it. Tom was a man who prided himself on his intuition and his ability to read people, skills that had served him well in his business dealings. But this time, it wasn't a business partner or a client he was trying to understand. It was his own wife. The person he thought he knew better than anyone in the world had suddenly become a mystery to him. Her late-night text messages, the way she would suddenly become flustered when he asked about her day, and the odd times she would leave the house for errands that seemed to take far longer than they should. All of these signs pointed to something amiss. Tom's growing unease led him to start paying closer attention to Sarah's behavior. He began to notice small things that he had previously dismissed, a certain nervousness in her laugh, a reluctance to make eye contact, and the way she seemed to be guarding her phone more closely than usual. It wasn't long before Tom's suspicions started to zero in on the person he least expected, his father, James. The realization struck Tom like a blow. At first, he dismissed the idea as absurd. James was a pillar of the community, a man of integrity and traditional values. The very thought that his father could be involved in something as sordid as an affair with his daughter-in-law seemed preposterous. But the more Tom observed, the more the pieces started to fall into place. He noticed how James and Sarah would sometimes share a glance that lingered just a moment too long, or how they would conveniently be alone in the kitchen or on the porch during family gatherings. These moments, though fleeting, planted seeds of doubt in Tom's mind. Determined to uncover the truth, Tom began to dig deeper. He checked Sarah's phone when she wasn't looking, scanning through her messages and call logs for any signs of inappropriate contact. While she had been careful to delete most of their exchanges, a few cryptic messages had slipped through, ones that hinted at more than just a father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. Tom's heart raced as he read the words, his worst fears slowly being confirmed. His suspicions were further fueled by the changes he noticed in James. His father, usually composed and reserved, had become more withdrawn, often avoiding Tom's gaze during conversations. When Tom mentioned Sarah's name, there was a slight tension in James's demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but to Tom, it was like a flashing red light signaling that something was wrong. Tom's anxiety grew with each passing day. He found himself constantly on edge, replaying every interaction, every word spoken between Sarah and James in his mind, searching for clues. The emotional toll of his suspicions began to weigh heavily on him, leading to sleepless nights and a growing sense of paranoia. He became obsessed with finding out the truth, no matter the cost. The breaking point came when Tom stumbled upon a receipt for a hotel room tucked away in the glove compartment of Sarah's car. The date on the receipt corresponded with one of the days Sarah had claimed to be visiting a friend out of town. The realization that she had been lying to him, that she had been with someone else, likely his own father, was a devastating blow. With the evidence mounting and his emotions in turmoil, Tom knew he could no longer ignore the situation. His world was unraveling, and he was left with no choice but to confront the people he loved most, to demand answers, and to face the painful truth that would soon tear his family apart. The confrontation that followed would not only expose the affair, but would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a tragedy none of them could have anticipated. The tension that had been building in Tom's life reached its breaking point during a family dinner meant to celebrate his father James's 55th birthday. What was supposed to be a night of joy and togetherness quickly turned into an evening that would forever change the lives of those involved. Tom had spent the entire day in a state of barely contained rage, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and deceit. He had decided that tonight, in the presence of his wife Sarah and his father, he would confront them both. The emotional burden of the suspicions he harbored had become too great to bear, and he needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. As the family gathered around the dinner table, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Tom could barely meet Sarah's eyes, and every time she spoke, her voice seemed to grate on his nerves. James, oblivious to what was about to unfold, was his usual composed self, making small talk and occasionally glancing at Sarah in a way that only fueled Tom's anger. The meal progressed slowly, each course feeling like an eternity to Tom. He could feel the storm brewing inside him, his pulse quickening as he mentally rehearsed the confrontation he was about to initiate. He glanced around the table, seeing the faces of the people he loved, and knowing that in just a few minutes, everything would be irrevocably changed. Finally, as the plates were cleared away and the cake was brought out, Tom could take it no longer. The words burst out of him with a force that silenced the room. "Sarah, James, I know what's been going on between you two." The room went deathly quiet. Sarah's face drained of color, and James froze, the knife he had been holding to cut the cake suspended in midair. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the shock of Tom's accusation hung in the air. Sarah tried to stammer out a denial, her voice trembling as she struggled to find the words. "Tom, what are you talking about? You're not making any sense." But Tom cut her off, his voice rising in anger. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I've seen the messages, the hotel receipt. I know everything. James, still holding the knife, finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with tension. Tom, let's not do this here. We can talk about this later privately. No! Tom shouted, slamming his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. We're going to talk about it now. How could you, Dad? How could you betray your own son like this? The confrontation escalated quickly from there, with Sarah breaking down into tears and James trying desperately to maintain control of the situation. Tom, however, was beyond reasoning. The hurt and betrayal he felt had turned into a blinding rage, and all he could think about was making them both pay for what they had done to him. In the heat of the moment, as accusations and denials flew back and forth, Tom grabbed the closest object, a heavy, ornate candlestick that had been a wedding gift to him and Sarah, and pointed it toward James. The room erupted into chaos as James instinctively raised a knife he was still holding to defend himself. The two men struggled for a moment, their physical battle mirroring the emotional one that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. In the midst of the scuffle, Sarah screamed for them to stop, but her pleas went unheard. The fight between Tom and James intensified, with both men fueled by anger and desperation. It was a brutal, primal struggle, with neither willing to back down. Then, in an instant, it was over. Tom, driven by a fury he could no longer control, swung the candlestick with all his might, striking James on the side of the head. The impact was sickening, and James collapsed to the ground unconscious and bleeding. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Sarah's sobs and Tom's heavy breathing. Realizing what he had done, Tom dropped the candlestick, his anger replaced by a cold, numbing dread. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The confrontation had spiraled into violence, and now nothing would ever be the same. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation at the Johnson household was a whirlwind of chaos, disbelief, and desperation. The living room, once a symbol of family gatherings and shared memories, was now a scene of horror, stained with blood and the consequences of an unthinkable act. As the realization of what he had done set in, Tom stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of his father, James. The candlestick, the weapon of the crime, lay at his feet, still smeared with blood. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft, anguished sobs of Sarah, who was crumpled on the floor near James's body, her face buried in her hands. The reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. Her affair had not only destroyed her marriage, but had now led to a fatal outcome. Panic quickly set in for both Tom and Sarah. The magnitude of the situation was overwhelming, and neither knew what to do. Tom, his hands trembling, tried to approach Sarah, but she recoiled in fear and shock, unable to look at him. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything that had just happened. The confrontation, the violence, and now, the death of the man she had secretly loved. In the midst of their panic, the sound of distant sirens began to grow louder, a neighbor having called the police after hearing the commotion. The sirens pierced the night, signaling the approach of law enforcement and the inevitable consequences that awaited them. Sarah looked at Tom with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that their lives were about to change forever. When the police arrived, they were met with a scene of utter devastation. The officers, accustomed to witnessing the aftermath of violent crimes, were nonetheless taken aback by the sight that greeted them. They found Sarah, still in shock, barely able to speak, and Tom, standing over his father's body, covered in blood and visibly distraught. The lead officer immediately called for backup and an ambulance, though it was clear that James was beyond saving. He approached Tom cautiously, his hand on his holster, unsure of how Tom would react. Tom, however, made no move to resist. He simply stood there, staring down at his father as if in a trance. When the officer gently took his arm and placed him in handcuffs, Tom didn't protest. He was led away, his expression one of hollow despair. Sarah was taken aside by another officer, who tried to comfort her as best he could while taking her statement. She was incoherent, her words a jumbled mess of apologies, regret, and fear. The officer, realizing the depth of her trauma, stopped questioning her and instead offered her a blanket, urging her to sit down as they waited for the paramedics. As the paramedics arrived and confirmed James's death, the crime scene became a flurry of activity. Photographs were taken, evidence was collected, and the house was cordoned off with crime scene tape. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering amongst themselves, their faces pale with shock as they tried to comprehend the tragedy that had unfolded in their quiet community. Tom was placed in the back of a police car, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Guilt, anger, sorrow. All of these swirled within him, making it impossible for him to focus on any one thought. He had killed his father, a man he had loved and admired, but also someone who had betrayed him in the most profound way imaginable. The weight of that betrayal, coupled with the irreversible act he had committed, bore down on him with crushing force. Back in the house, Sarah was being questioned further by detectives who had arrived on the scene. She recounted the affair, the confrontation, and the moments leading up to James's death, her voice trembling as she relived the nightmare. She knew that the truth would soon be out in the open, that the affair she had tried so desperately to keep hidden would now be exposed to the world. As Tom was driven away to the police station, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He knew that he would be facing a trial, that he would likely spend years, if not the rest of his life, in prison. The thought of it was unbearable. But so was the thought of living with what he had done. In the back of the police car, Tom finally broke down, the tears he had been holding back flowing freely as the gravity of his actions crushed him completely. The life he had known was over, and all that remained was a long road of consequences that lay ahead. The trial of Tom Johnson became a media sensation, capturing the attention of the entire nation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the unfolding of a case that had shocked the small town and beyond. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven to commit a heinous crime by jealousy and rage, while the defense argued that Tom had been a loving son and husband, pushed to the brink by the unbearable betrayal of his father and wife. Tom's trial was marked by intense emotional testimony. Sarah took the stand, recounting her affair with James and the events leading up to that fateful night. Her voice wavered as she described the guilt and confusion that had consumed her, the love she had once felt for her husband, and the forbidden passion that had drawn her to James. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The defense sought to portray Tom as a man who had been overcome by a moment of temporary insanity, arguing that his actions were the result of an emotional breakdown triggered by the shock of discovering the affair. They presented character witnesses who testified to Tom's good nature, his dedication to his family, and his long history of being a pillar of the community. The defense also highlighted Tom's immediate remorse after the crime, pointing out that he had not attempted to flee and had cooperated fully with the authorities. However, the prosecution countered with a narrative of premeditated violence. They argued that Tom had suspected the affair for some time and had confronted James with the intention of causing harm. They emphasized the brutality of the attack, showing the jury the gruesome photos of the crime scene and the candlestick that had been used as the murder weapon. The prosecution called on expert witnesses to explain the severity of the injuries James had sustained, arguing that Tom's actions were deliberate and calculated. As the trial progressed, the small town where the Johnson family had lived was torn apart by the scandal. Neighbors who had once been close friends found themselves on opposite sides of the debate, with some supporting Tom and believing his actions were justified, while others saw him as a cold-blooded murderer. The town's churches, schools, and community centers buzzed with discussions about the case, and the once tight-knit community became fractured and divided. The jury deliberated for days, weighing the arguments of both sides and the emotional testimony they had heard. When they finally returned with a verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge asked Tom to stand as the jury foreman read the decision. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, with some spectators expressing relief that Tom would not be convicted of first-degree murder, while others were shocked that he was found guilty at all. Tom's sentencing hearing was equally charged with emotion. The judge, taking into account the complexity of the case, the nature of the crime, and Tom's previously unblemished record, sentenced him to a significant prison term, though less than the maximum allowed by law. The decision was met with mixed reactions, with some feeling that justice had been served, while others believed the punishment was too lenient or too harsh. For Sarah, the aftermath of the trial was a time of deep reflection and sorrow. The affair had not only cost her the life of her lover and the freedom of her husband, but it also left her isolated and shunned by many in the community. She struggled with feelings of guilt and remorse, haunted by the knowledge that her actions had set the tragic events in motion. The town, too, would never be the same. The Johnson case became a dark chapter in its history, a reminder of the hidden secrets that can fester beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect families. The story of Tom, Sarah, and James became a cautionary tale, often retold by locals as a warning about the dangers of betrayal, unchecked emotions, and the devastating consequences they can bring.